What if the deadliest war in history was started by a lie? What if a single staged event was all it took to ignite a global conflict? This is the story of the lie that lit the fuse for World War II. It is the final night of August 1939. The air over Europe is thick with tension, a palpable anxiety that hangs heavy in the late summer heat. For months, the continent has teetered on the brink of war, caught in a diplomatic dance of threats and appeasements, but somehow it clings to a fragile, fraying peace. Nations hold their breath, hoping against hope that diplomacy will prevail, that the storm clouds gathering on the horizon will dissipate. That peace, however, is about to be irrevocably shattered by a radio broadcast, an event so seemingly small yet so cataclysmic in its consequences. The location is the German-Polish border, a flashpoint of friction and manufactured grievances. Here, near the small German town of Gleiwitz, stands a modest radio station, an unremarkable outpost of the German state broadcasting network, its antenna reaching into the darkening sky. Suddenly, the routine programming is violently interrupted. The normal, placid sounds of the evening broadcast are replaced by chaos. Listeners tuning in would hear jarring, unfamiliar noises, shouts, commotion, and the unmistakable, terrifying crackle of gunfire. Over the airwaves, voices are heard, speaking German but shouting in Polish, their words laced with aggression and hostility. The sounds paint a picture of a violent takeover, an unprovoked assault on German soil by foreign invaders. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the transmission cuts out. The line goes dead. Silence descends once more, but it is a new kind of silence, one filled with menace and foreboding. The brief, violent broadcast has done its work, planting a seed of outrage and fear. In Berlin, the news is received not with shock, but with a grim sense of readiness. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the Third Reich, finally has what he has been waiting for. He has his excuse. This entire event, from the first shout to the final gunshot, was a meticulously crafted deception. It was a lie. A cynical, cold-blooded, and audacious lie. The attack on the Gleiwitz radio station was not the work of Polish aggressors. It was a clandestine operation, a piece of political theater directed by the highest echelons of the Nazi regime. The so-called Polish-speaking soldiers were, in reality, elite German SS commandos, handpicked for their ruthlessness and loyalty. They were disguised in authentic Polish army uniforms, their mission not to conquer, but to fabricate a provocation. This elaborate ruse was part of a larger, more comprehensive plan, known by the chillingly bureaucratic name, Operation Himmler. Named after its architect, the sinister head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, the operation was a series of staged border incidents designed to create the illusion of Polish aggression against Germany. The Gleiwitz incident was simply the most prominent and oral of these manufactured provocations. The purpose of this elaborate charade was singular and monstrous: to provide Adolf Hitler with a casus belli, a justifiable reason for war that he could sell to the German people and the international community. For weeks, Hitler had been amassing his armies on the Polish border, his war machine poised and ready to strike. He was determined to invade Poland, to reclaim the territory of the Polish Corridor and the free city of Danzig, and to take another step in his quest for Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. But even a dictator needs a pretext. He needed to portray Germany not as the aggressor, but as the victim, a nation forced to defend its sovereignty and its people against unprovoked attacks. The faked assault at Gleiwitz, broadcast for all to hear, was the perfect tool. It was a flimsy, transparent lie, a fabrication built on deceit and disguise. Yet, in the charged atmosphere of 1939, this flimsy lie was all Hitler needed to light the fuse on the powder keg of Europe and unleash the most destructive and devastating war in all of human history. On the morning of September 1st, citing the Polish attack at Gleiwitz, German forces poured across the border and the world plunged into darkness. The pre-dawn darkness of September 1st, 1939, is shattered. At precisely 4:45 a.m., long before diplomats have finished their coffee or any formal declaration of war has been uttered, the opening shots of what will become the most destructive conflict in human history are fired. The old German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, ironically in the free city of Danzig on a supposed goodwill visit, swivels its massive 11-inch guns. With a deafening roar that echoes across the placid waters, it unleashes a barrage of high-explosive shells not in a naval exercise, but in a calculated act of aggression against the small Polish military transit depot on the Westerplatte Peninsula. This is the first thunderclap of a gathering storm. Simultaneously, as the shells rain down on the bewildered Polish defenders at Westerplatte, a symphony of destruction is orchestrated all along the nearly 1,250-mile border. It's a coordinated, overwhelming surge of military might. 1.5 million German soldiers, the vanguard of the Wehrmacht, pour across the frontier from the north, west, and south. They are not alone. Accompanying them are over 2,700 panzers, tanks that will become the steel fist of this new assault, and more than 2,000 aircraft of the Luftwaffe, darkening the skies. This is the execution of a meticulously planned operation, codenamed VALOR, or Case White. It is far more than a simple invasion or a border skirmish. It is the terrifying, world-altering debut of a revolutionary and brutal new form of warfare. The world is about to learn a new, chilling word: Blitzkrieg. The concept behind Fall Weiss was born from the ashes of Germany's defeat in World War I. The static, grinding trench warfare of the Western Front, which had consumed millions of lives for mere yards of mud, was a national trauma that German military theorists were determined never to repeat. Thinkers like Heinz Guderian championed a radical new doctrine centered on speed, surprise, and decisive action. They envisioned a form of war that avoided a protracted slugging match by concentrating overwhelming force at specific, weak points in the enemy's defenses. This strategy, which would later be dubbed Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was a combined arms approach. The plan was simple in its audacity. Instead of a broad, slow-moving front, armored divisions, the panzers, would act as the spearhead. They would smash through the enemy lines at key sectors, not to occupy territory but to drive deep into the enemy's rear, bypassing strong points and creating chaos. Their primary targets were not the frontline soldiers, but the command centers, communication lines, and supply depots that formed the nervous system of the Polish army. Once these vital organs were severed, the main body of the enemy forces would be paralyzed, unable to coordinate a coherent defense. Following close behind the panzers were motorized infantry divisions, tasked with mopping up the encircled and now isolated pockets of resistance. Hovering above it all was the Luftwaffe, Germany's powerful air force. It had a dual role in this new symphony of war. First, it was to achieve absolute air superiority, sweeping the Polish Air Force from the skies to give the ground troops complete freedom of movement. Its second, and perhaps more terrifying role, was to act as flying artillery. Stuka dive bombers with their infamous Jericho trumpets, sirens designed to induce psychological terror, would plummet from the sky to deliver precision strikes on bunkers, artillery positions, and troop concentrations, effectively clearing the path for the advancing panzers. This aerial bombardment was not limited to military targets. Railways, bridges, and even columns of fleeing refugees were attacked to sow panic and disrupt any attempt at mobilization or retreat. Fall Weiss was designed not just to defeat the Polish army but to annihilate its ability to fight, to break its will through a relentless, shocking, and overwhelming display of force. The Polish military, in stark contrast, was an army caught between two eras. It possessed a proud and brave fighting spirit, forged in its recent victory over the Soviets in 1920, but its structure and equipment were largely outdated. The Polish High Command, expecting a more traditional war of attrition, had dispersed its forces thinly along the vast border in a bid to defend every inch of Polish soil. This cordon defense strategy, while politically understandable, was a strategic catastrophe when faced with the concentrated spearheads of the Blitzkrieg. It meant that there were no significant operational reserves held in the rear. When the German panzers broke through, there was nothing to stop their rampage. Much has been made of the myth of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances, a piece of propaganda that has unfairly colored the perception of the Polish defense. While Poland did have cavalry brigades, which were, in reality, highly mobile infantry units that used horses for transportation but typically dismounted to fight, they were no match for mechanized divisions. The Polish Army's equipment was a mix of WWII-era gear and some more modern but insufficient weaponry. Their tank force consisted of fewer than 900 vehicles, most of which were light tanks or small tankettes, hopelessly outgunned by the German panzers. Their air force, though possessing some capable modern fighters like the PZL 11, was vastly outnumbered and caught largely on the ground in the initial Luftwaffe raids. Despite these overwhelming disadvantages, the Polish soldiers fought with incredible courage and tenacity. The defenders of Westerplatte, a garrison of just over 200 men, were expected to hold out for 12 hours. They resisted the full might of naval bombardments, dive bomber attacks, and infantry assaults for 7 days, becoming an enduring symbol of Polish defiance. In the Battle of the Bzura, the largest engagement of the campaign, Polish forces launched a desperate and initially successful counterattack, throwing the German Eighth Army into disarray and demonstrating their formidable fighting will. However, these acts of bravery, while heroic, could not halt the German juggernaut. The German superiority in numbers, technology, coordination, and, most importantly, doctrine, was simply too great. The Polish army was being systematically encircled and destroyed. As the German pincers closed around Warsaw, another predator, sensing weakness, prepared to strike. On September 17th, fulfilling the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed just weeks earlier, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Joseph Stalin, under the cynical pretext of protecting the Belarusian and Ukrainian minorities, sent the Red Army streaming across the border. For the already shattered Polish forces, this was the final, fatal blow. They were now caught in a hopeless two-front war, crushed between the Nazi hammer and the Soviet anvil. The Polish government and high command were forced to flee into exile through Romania, vowing to continue the fight from abroad. On September 27th, after weeks of relentless aerial bombardment and artillery siege that reduced large parts of the city to rubble and killed tens of thousands of civilians, Warsaw finally surrendered. The last organized pockets of Polish resistance were subdued by October 6th. In just over a month, the Second Polish Republic, a nation resurrected after World War I, had been wiped off the map, its territory partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The campaign had been a staggering success for Germany, achieved at a relatively low cost in German casualties. The invasion of Poland was more than just the first campaign of World War II. It was a chilling demonstration of the brutal efficiency of modern, industrialized warfare. The Blitzkrieg doctrine had been proven devastatingly effective. The speed and ferocity of the assault stunned the world. For France and Great Britain, who had declared war on Germany on September 3rd, but launched no meaningful offensive to aid their Polish ally, a period that would become known as the Phony War, the Polish campaign was a terrifying preview of what was to come. They had witnessed the storm break, but had failed to grasp the true nature of the lightning that now threatened to engulf all of Europe. The fall of Poland was not an end, but a beginning. It was the first act in a global tragedy, and the terrifying lessons of Fall Weiss would soon be learned by the rest of the world, written in fire and steel across the continent. The world was about to learn a new word, a term that would echo through history with the sound of screeching sirens and clanking steel: Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. This was not the grim, grinding attrition of World War I, where armies bled for years over a few meters of mud. This was a symphony of terror, a brutal masterpiece of military innovation built on two unyielding pillars: speed, and shock. The strategy, in its devastating simplicity, was to punch a hole and then pour through it with overwhelming force, bypassing strong points and severing the enemy's command and control before they even knew what hit them. The curtain rose on this new theater of war with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, sweeping the skies with predatory efficiency. Their primary targets were the Polish airfields. In the opening hours of the invasion, waves of German bombers struck before most Polish planes could even get their wheels off the ground, achieving air superiority in a matter of days. This initial strike was crucial. It blinded the Polish army, cutting them off from reconnaissance and leaving their ground troops exposed and vulnerable to the horrors that were to follow from the air. Then came the Stuka dive bombers, the flying psychological terror weapon of the Wehrmacht. These were not just bombers. They were a new kind of mobile artillery, designed to deliver precision strikes with demoralizing effect. Fitted with wind-driven sirens nicknamed the Jericho trumpets, their terrifying scream as they plummeted towards the earth became synonymous with the Blitzkrieg itself. This sound was a calculated tool of psychological warfare, designed to shatter the morale of defenders, create mass panic among civilians, and disrupt the enemy's ability to organize a coherent response. The Stukas targeted key infrastructure, bridges, communication lines, and railway junctions, as well as troop concentrations, acting in close concert with the ground forces they were clearing a path for. Finally, with the skies secured and the enemy disoriented, the panzers, the armored steel fist of the Wehrmacht, were unleashed. Organized into powerful, independent divisions, these tanks were not used as infantry support in the traditional sense. Instead, they were the spearhead, concentrating their might to smash through the weakest point identified in the Polish lines. Once a breach was made, they did not stop to engage fortified positions or mop up resistance on their flanks. Their mission was singular: to drive deep, relentlessly, into the heart of the country. They raced ahead, severing supply lines, encircling entire armies, and sowing chaos in the enemy's rear, effectively paralyzing the Polish high command and leaving their frontline soldiers isolated and surrounded. This was the essence of lightning war, a coordinated, multi-pronged assault where speed was the ultimate weapon, and the psychological shock it induced was just as destructive as the shells and bombs. History often paints Poland in 1939 as a fragile nation, easily shattered by the might of the German war machine. It's a picture of weakness, of a backward country caught completely off guard. But this image, carefully crafted by Hitler's propaganda, couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is that Poland was not some helpless bystander in the path of a storm. It was a nation with a large, well-equipped, and profoundly brave army, an army that stood ready to defend its sovereignty with every fiber of its being. This was not a story of a weak domino falling. It was the story of a determined and formidable opponent facing an unprecedented form of warfare. The Polish military was a force to be reckoned with, boasting nearly 1 million active soldiers, a number that could swell to over 2.5 million upon full mobilization. Their soldiers were renowned for their discipline, their patriotism, and a fierce fighting spirit forged in the crucible of a century of struggle for independence. They had modern rifles, effective anti-tank weapons, and a nascent but capable air force. This was not the army of a minor power, but one of the largest and most dedicated in Europe at the time. However, this powerful military instrument was built for a different kind of war. The Polish High Command, like many of their contemporaries across Europe, were students of the Great War. Their doctrines, their strategies, and their entire military philosophy were shaped by the lessons learned on the battlefields of 1914 to 1918. They anticipated a conflict of attrition, a methodical war of fronts and phases. Their grand strategy was predicated on a traditional, almost stately approach to combat. The plan was to trade space for time. They expected the initial German assault to push them back, but they envisioned an orderly, fighting withdrawal. Their armies would fall back to a series of pre-prepared defensive lines anchored on the country's major river systems like the Vistula and the Narew. These natural barriers would slow the German advance, allowing Polish forces to consolidate and mount a stiff, prolonged defense. This was not a strategy of defeatism, but a calculated and logical plan. The ultimate goal was to hold out long enough for their powerful allies, Britain and France, to honor their treaty obligations and launch a massive offensive against Germany's undefended western border. The Polish believed they were the anvil, holding the Wehrmacht in place while the Anglo-French hammer fell from the west, crushing the Third Reich between them. It was a sound plan, a textbook solution to a conventional invasion. But the Germans were not planning to fight a conventional war. The storm that broke on September 1st, 1939, was something the world had never seen before: the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. Blitzkrieg was not just a new tactic, it was a revolution in the very concept of warfare. It didn't allow for the orderly retreats and strategic pauses that the Polish plan depended upon. Instead of a broad, grinding advance, the Germans used their panzers and Stuka dive bombers as a scalpel. They concentrated their armored divisions into powerful spearheads, or Schwurpunkte, that bypassed strongpoints and sliced deep into the Polish rear. They didn't attack the front, they tore through it. Their objective was not to defeat the Polish army in a head-on battle, but to paralyze it. The Stukas screamed down from the sky, shattering communication lines, bombing railway junctions, and terrorizing columns of retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians. The panzers, supported by motorized infantry, raced ahead, severing supply lines and encircling vast formations of Polish troops. The Polish High Command, expecting to manage a controlled withdrawal to the Vistula, suddenly found their telegraphed orders were useless. The lines were cut, the roads were choked, and the armies they were trying to direct were already being surrounded. Entire infantry divisions, marching to their designated defensive positions, found themselves cut off, isolated, and fighting for their very survival in chaotic pockets of resistance, miles behind the supposed front line. The traditional rhythm of battle, attack, defend, regroup, had been utterly shattered. The Poles were caught in a whirlwind. In the midst of this technological and tactical onslaught, the bravery of the Polish soldier shone with a desperate light. Their cavalry brigades, in particular, have become a symbol of this doomed courage, though often misrepresented by propaganda. The popular myth of Polish lancers charging tanks with raised sabers is a distortion, a caricature used to paint the Poles as hopelessly anachronistic. The reality was more complex and far more tragic. The Polish cavalry were not medieval knights. They were highly mobile elite infantry units who used horses for rapid movement, dismounting to fight with rifles, machine guns, and Bofor's anti-tank guns. They were an effective and feared force. However, in the face of Blitzkrieg, their mobility was rendered moot. On occasion, in the confusion and desperation of a surprise encounter, a cavalry unit might find itself in a desperate charge against armored vehicles, not as a primary tactic, but as a last, suicidal act of defiance when all other options were exhausted. They fought with a courage that bordered on the superhuman, but their rifles and lances were ultimately useless against the impervious steel hides of the panzer tanks. The visceral image of horseflesh against rolled steel became a powerful metaphor for the entire campaign. A clash of eras, a collision between past and future. They were magnificent soldiers, but they were trapped in the wrong war. The story of the 1939 defense of Poland is one of profound tragedy. It is the story of a nation and an army that did everything right according to the established rules of war. They were prepared, they were brave, and they had a logical, coherent plan. But their enemy had rewritten the rulebook. The Polish military was trying to solve a 1939 problem, the problem of mechanized, three-dimensional warfare using 1918 solutions, the solutions of static lines and attrition. Their desperate courage was undeniable, their sacrifice immense, but it was not enough. They were outmaneuvered, not outfought. They were encircled, not broken. For 36 brutal days, they fought on. inflicting heavy casualties on the invaders and shocking the German command with the ferocity of their resistance. They were not the weak, backward nation of propaganda. They were a proud, strong people who stood first against the tide, a brave, doomed defense that marked the true beginning of the Second World War. For 2 weeks, the world watched as Poland reeled under the merciless German onslaught. The Blitzkrieg, a terrifying new form of warfare, had torn through the Polish defenses with brutal efficiency. Warsaw, the proud and defiant capital, was encircled, its skies darkened by the constant shadow of the Luftwaffe. Day and night, the city was subjected to a ruthless and indiscriminate bombing campaign, a relentless rain of fire and steel that reduced historic streets to rubble and turned homes into tombs. The resilience of the Polish people was astonishing. Soldiers and civilians alike fought with a courage born of desperation, holding on to a sliver of hope that their Western allies, Britain and France, would come to their aid. But as the days bled into weeks, that hope began to fade, replaced by the grim reality of their isolation. The Polish military, though outmatched in technology and numbers, fought valiantly. They mounted counterattacks, defended strongpoints with suicidal bravery, and refused to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The plan was to retreat, to fall back towards the southeast, towards the Romanian border. There, in the rugged terrain of eastern Poland, they hoped to form a new, more defensible line. It was a desperate gambit, a last stand designed to buy precious time, to hold out until the promised Allied relief arrived from the west. They gathered their battered divisions, their remaining tanks and artillery, and began the arduous process of reorganizing for this final, desperate chapter of their defense. The fate of their nation hung precariously in the balance, dependent on this one last line of defense in the east. But the final, cynical betrayal was yet to come, a blow more devastating than any bomb that fell on Warsaw. On the morning of September 17, 1939, as the exhausted Polish forces were struggling to establish their new defensive positions, a new enemy appeared on the horizon. The Soviet Union, a power that had postured as a neutral observer, invaded from the east. Over 500,000 Red Army soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, poured across the border. They met little organized resistance, for the bulk of Poland's army was already engaged in a life-or-death struggle against the Germans in the west. This was not a spontaneous act of aggression. It was the calculated and chilling fulfillment of a secret agreement. This was the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the unholy alliance between Hitler and Stalin to carve Poland in two. Signed just weeks before the invasion, the non-aggression treaty had shocked the world, uniting two seemingly irreconcilable ideologies, Nazism and communism. But hidden within its clauses was a clandestine addendum, a cold-blooded plan to partition Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was the first and primary victim. The agreement meticulously drew a line through the heart of the country, assigning the western half to Germany and the eastern half to the Soviet Union. The Soviet invasion on September 17th was simply Stalin collecting his share of the spoils, a predatory move coordinated with Hitler to ensure Poland's complete and total destruction. The Polish government and high command were caught completely by surprise. The invasion from the east shattered their last strategic hope. The planned defensive line near the Romanian border became instantly untenable. Orders were given not to engage the Soviets, a desperate and futile attempt to avoid a two-front war they could not possibly win, and perhaps a naive hope that the Western Allies might still intervene. Soldiers were instructed to retreat towards neutral Romania and Hungary, to preserve what remained of the Polish army for a future fight. For the average Polish soldier, the situation was one of utter confusion and despair. They were now trapped between the Nazi hammer and the Soviet anvil, squeezed from both sides by two of the most powerful and ruthless military machines on the planet. With its territory overrun from east and west, its government forced into exile, and its armies broken and scattered, the Polish state effectively ceased to exist. The coordinated invasions ensured that there would be no last stand, no bastion of resistance left within Poland's borders. The stab in the back was complete. Warsaw would hold out for another 10 days, a final heroic act of defiance, but its fate was sealed. The joint victory parade of German and Soviet troops in Brest-Litovsk became a grotesque symbol of this monstrous pact, a celebration of the cynical destruction of a sovereign nation. The Fourth Partition of Poland was a reality, and the country disappeared from the map of Europe, swallowed whole by its two powerful neighbors, plunging the continent and the world into the darkest war in human history. Create hook sentences for the first 10 seconds. On September 3rd, Britain and France, honoring their guarantee to Poland, formally declared war on Germany. For the Polish people, it was a moment of hope, a belief that they were not alone in their struggle against the overwhelming might of the German invasion that had begun just 2 days prior. The airwaves crackled with the news, and despite the grim reality on the ground, a sense of relief permeated the besieged nation. The world's two largest empires had joined the fight. Surely the tide would turn. But that hope quickly faded. As German panzers sliced through Polish defenses and the Luftwaffe rained destruction from above, all eyes turned to the west, expectantly waiting for the promised Allied counterattack. The Polish High Command had based its entire defensive strategy on the assumption that a major French offensive would force the Germans to divert crucial resources from the Polish front within 2 weeks. This was not a naive hope. It was a strategic calculation based on explicit military agreements. Yet the great offensive never materialized. On the Western Front, an eerie quiet descended. French and British troops sat in their formidable fortifications, the Maginot Line and its corresponding British defenses, in a state of surreal inaction. This period of stagnation, of waiting and watching, would become known derisively as the phony war, or the Blitzkrieg, the sitting war. While Poland burned, the Allied soldiers dug trenches, conducted minor reconnaissance patrols, and engaged in sporadic, almost symbolic skirmishes. There was no mass mobilization for a grand assault, no thunderous artillery barrages to signal the start of a second front. The vast military machines of France and Britain, while officially at war, remained largely idle. Poland was left to die alone. The isolation was not just military but also psychological. Each passing day without a significant Allied move was another nail in the coffin of Polish resistance. The heroic but ultimately futile defense of garrisons like the Westerplatte, the desperate cavalry charges against German tanks, and the valiant efforts of the Polish Air Force became acts of national sacrifice rather than strategic holds. The promised relief was a mirage. German forces, unburdened by a major threat in the West, were free to concentrate their full devastating power on crushing Poland with brutal efficiency. The situation was made catastrophically worse on September 17th, when the Soviet Union, in accordance with the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland from the east, sealing the nation's fate. On September 27th, after weeks of relentless siege, constant aerial bombardment, and the systematic destruction of its infrastructure, the capital city of Warsaw finally surrendered. The defenders, having exhausted their ammunition, food, and medical supplies, could fight no more. The fall of Warsaw symbolized the end of Poland's organized national resistance, a tragic testament to its abandonment by its allies. Though pockets of resistance continued to fight with incredible bravery, the war was effectively over. The last organized Polish units laid down their arms on October 6th, following the Battle of Kock. The campaign had lasted just 36 days. Poland, the first nation to stand up to Hitler's aggression in 1939, had been wiped off the map, partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Its government fled into exile and its people were subjected to a reign of terror. The phony war in the West would continue for several more months, a period of false calm before the storm would finally break over Europe. But for Poland, the war had been all too real, and its conclusion devastatingly final. On September 1st, 1939, the world held its breath as German forces stormed across the Polish border, unleashing a storm of steel and fire. This was more than just the war's first campaign. It was a terrifying demonstration of German military genius and ruthless ambition. It was the moment the world realized that appeasement was dead and that Adolf Hitler's S-word was utterly worthless. This invasion showcased a new, faster, and more brutal way of fighting, a terrifying doctrine that would soon bring France, Belgium, and Holland to their knees. The swift, brutal, and tragic fall of Poland was not the cause of World War II, but it was the definitive spark, the first domino to fall in a conflict that would consume the entire globe for 6 bloody years. The invasion, codenamed Fall Weiss, or Case White, was the culmination of months of escalating tension and diplomatic maneuvering. For years, the Western powers, led by Britain and France, had pursued a policy of appeasement, desperately hoping to avoid another catastrophic war by conceding to Hitler's demands. They had stood by as Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and carved up Czechoslovakia at the Munich Conference. Each concession was made with the belief that it would be the last, that Hitler's territorial ambitions would finally be satisfied. But the Führer's appetite for conquest was insatiable. His true goal was not merely to reclaim lost German territories, but to secure Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people in Eastern Europe, a goal that could only be achieved through war and subjugation. Poland was the next logical target. Hitler manufactured a pretext, claiming that the German minority in Poland was being persecuted and demanding the return of the free city of Danzig and access across the Polish corridor. These demands were a smokescreen. The real objective was the complete annihilation of the Polish state. To ensure a swift victory and avoid a two-front war, Hitler executed a stunning diplomatic reversal. On August 23, 1939, the world was shocked to learn that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two sworn ideological enemies, had signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who brokered it, contained a secret protocol that sealed Poland's fate. The two totalitarian powers agreed to carve up Poland between them, with the Vistula, Narew, and San rivers forming the new border. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was free to unleash his war machine without fear of Soviet intervention. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, on a supposed goodwill visit to Danzig, opened fire on the Polish military depot at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, all along the 1,050-mile border, 1.5 million German soldiers, 2,700 tanks, and 2,300 aircraft surged into Poland. This was the world's first exposure to a terrifying new form of warfare, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The concept was simple but devastatingly effective. Instead of the static, attritional trench warfare of World War I, Blitzkrieg emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming force at a single, decisive point. Spearheaded by fast-moving panzer divisions and supported by the relentless dive bombing of the Luftwaffe's Stuka bombers, the German army aimed to punch through enemy lines, encircle and destroy defending forces, and sow chaos and panic deep in the enemy's rear. The Polish military, though brave and determined, was tragically outmatched. It was a force caught between two eras, fielding modern anti-tank guns and aircraft alongside cavalry brigades armed with lances and sabers. While tales of Polish cavalry charging German tanks are largely a myth born of propaganda, they symbolize the technological chasm between the two armies. The Polish defense plan, Plan West, relied on defending the country's long and exposed borders, hoping to hold out long enough for their allies, Britain and France, to launch a promised relief offensive from the West. It was a strategy that played directly into the hands of the German Blitzkrieg. By spreading their forces thinly, the Poles were unable to create a strong, concentrated defense, allowing German panzers to break through at multiple points with ease. The Luftwaffe quickly established air superiority, its bombers raining terror not only on military targets but also on civilian infrastructure. Roads, railways, and communication lines were systematically destroyed, paralyzing the Polish ability to mobilize and reposition their troops. Streams of refugees fleeing the carnage clogged the roads, further impeding the movement of Polish forces. The city of Wielun was one of the first to feel the Luftwaffe's wrath, bombed into rubble in the opening hours of the invasion despite having no military or strategic value. This was terror bombing, a deliberate tactic designed to break the will of the Polish people. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Poles fought back with ferocious courage. At the Battle of the Bzura, the largest engagement of the campaign, Polish forces launched a desperate counterattack against the flank of the advancing German Eighth Army, initially catching the Germans by surprise and inflicting heavy casualties. For a brief moment, it seemed the Polish spirit might halt the seemingly unstoppable German advance. However, the German response was swift and brutal. They quickly redeployed their forces, encircling the Polish armies and subjecting them to a relentless barrage of artillery and air attacks. The battle ended in a crushing Polish defeat, with over 170,000 soldiers taken prisoner. The backbone of the Polish army was broken. While the Polish army was being systematically dismantled in the west, a second hammer blow fell from the east. On September 17th, honoring the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east. The Polish government, which had just fled to Romania, was caught completely by surprise. The Polish forces on the eastern border, already depleted to reinforce the front against Germany, offered minimal resistance. The Soviet invasion was the final, fatal stab in the back. Trapped between two of the most powerful military machines on the planet, the fate of Poland was sealed. The defense of the capital, Warsaw, became a symbol of Poland's tragic and heroic resistance. For 3 weeks, the city's defenders, a mix of regular army units and civilian volunteers, held out against a relentless German siege. The Luftwaffe subjected the city to round-the-clock bombing, turning entire districts into seas of rubble and fire. Food, water, and ammunition dwindled, but the city refused to surrender. The mayor of Warsaw, Stefan Starzyński, became the voice of the resistance, his radio broadcasts rallying the spirits of the besieged population until the very end. But courage alone could not defeat panzers and bombs. On September 27th, with the city in ruins and its defenders exhausted, Warsaw finally surrendered. By October 6, 1939, organized Polish resistance had ceased. In just over a month, a nation of 35 million people had been conquered and dismembered. The campaign had been a stunning success for Germany, achieved at a relatively low cost of around 16,000 killed. Polish losses, in contrast, were catastrophic. Over 66,000 soldiers killed, 133,000 wounded, and nearly 700,000 taken prisoner by the Germans, with another 200,000 captured by the Soviets. But the military defeat was only the beginning of Poland's nightmare. The country was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, and a reign of terror began. The Nazi occupation was particularly brutal, aimed at not just controlling the population, but systematically destroying Polish culture and enslaving its people. Intellectuals, priests, political leaders, and army officers were rounded up and executed in mass killings, such as the infamous Katyn Forest Massacre perpetrated by the Soviet secret police. For the world, the fall of Poland was a terrifying wake-up call. On September 3rd, 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France, honoring their treaty obligations to Poland, declared war on Germany. But their declaration was not backed by immediate, decisive action. The promised Western offensive never materialized. Instead, the French army remained behind the supposed safety of the Maginot Line, and the British sent a small expeditionary force to France. This period of inaction, known as the Phony War, or Sitzkrieg, sitting war, allowed Hitler to consolidate his gains in Poland and prepare for his next move. The speed and ferocity of the Blitzkrieg had stunned the Allied military leadership, who were still mentally fighting the last war. They failed to grasp the revolutionary nature of this new form of warfare, a failure that would cost them dearly in the spring of 1940. The invasion of Poland was the first chapter in the bloodiest conflict in human history. It demonstrated the lethal efficiency of the German war machine and the utter ruthlessness of the Nazi regime. It exposed the futility of appeasement and the bankruptcy of a world order that had failed to stand up to aggression. The bravery of the Polish soldiers and civilians who fought against impossible odds served as an inspiration, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a nation that refused to be extinguished. The fall of Poland was not an isolated event. It was the trigger, the first domino in a chain reaction that would set the world ablaze, leading to years of unimaginable suffering, destruction, and heroism, forever changing the course of the 20th century.